Welcome. This tutorial will help you with attribution questions and multiple entries in a bibliography that look very, very similar. So I wanted to know more about Carlisle Bargeron, and I'll tell you why very shortly. And if you Google him, you can't find a whole lot. He's not in Wikipedia, he's not in the Biography Reference Bank, he's not on the Annals of American History. Why would I even care about Carlisle Bargeron? Well, if we do a ProQuest search for the New Deal and antitrust somewhere between 1933 and 1935 and look for editorial content, we find a whole series of articles written by Carlisle Bargeron. And they range over 1933 to 1935. Interesting little column. And it's also helpful to sort of give some context for this. And he wrote most of those columns during the first New Deal. And if we look at a history of all of the articles that Carlisle Bargeron wrote over the course of his career, we find that he was basically, presumably, given the number of articles that he wrote between 1944 and 1931, a staff writer for the Washington Post. Then he must have left based on that series of numbers. And then in 1933 and 1934, he came back to the Washington Post and wrote this column along the Potomac with Carlisle Bargeron. And then much later after the war, he wrote a couple of letters to the editor, two different papers. So what's unique about those 13 articles is that they are actually indexed all on their own in the Washington Post index, which is on the front page. And they don't appear on the editorial page, nor do they appear in the letters to the editor, but they do appear on the op-ed page. So you might be wondering how we actually got to see those the whole newspaper from 1935. That is an option in ProQuest historical newspapers that you should keep in mind, because you get to see ads and cartoons and all kinds of other good stuff. All right, also, a new feature in ProQuest is that you can export your citations directly to EasyBib from ProQuest. Okay, so these are op-ed columns. We've established that. And how do you reference them in your research paper? Well, you don't reference them exactly the same way as you would the first 1,324 articles that he wrote, because that's when he was a staff writer, and clearly he's got a different sense now. Nor do you reference them exactly the same way you would his letters to the editor that came very much later after the war. So if you were to quote one of his earlier references, earlier articles from, let's say his very first byline in 1924, here's a little blurb from the article that we're going to quote. And here is the part of my narrative there. I'm actually referencing him. And you see this quote right here where it says the political lines were sharply drawn, traceable back to the Civil War, etc., to the close quote. That is a quote taken directly from the Bargeron article, and all I need to do with reference it is to just say Bargeron in parentheses, because that will give me the roadmap back to the part of the bibliography that has Bargeron's name, except when you have numerous entries by the same author in your bibliography, and it looks like that. Now I want to make a note that those dash 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 with a period, that replaces the name if the name appears several times in the same bibliography, and that is something you should do too. So this is the article I'm trying to reference in that citation, or in that reference. And here is the actual citation. This is what it would look like. And what I've chosen to do here, just to make sure that we distinguish this article from all the other citations in the bibliography by Carlisle Bargeron, is to include the word Davis, which is a shortened name for the article. Okay, so we don't want to write the whole name of the article. Davis will separate it from the others. Something to distinguish it from all the other entries. All right, so back in 1924, Bargeron was just a rookie staff writer, and he doesn't really bring any specific expertise to the article, so he should only be credited parenthetically. Since the work cited includes numerous works by Bargeron, include the next item that distinguishes this citation from the others. All right, so this is what it looks like. Clear? All right. So, but what if we're citing Bargeron's op-ed columns? Do we cite them differently? And the answer, of course, is yes. So we would start quoting him like, according to Carlisle Bargeron, but then wait, you actually really do need to know something about Carlisle Bargeron before you can start attributing this quote to him and contextualizing it with some background on Carlisle Bargeron. So we know one thing about him is that he's pretty hard to Google. So we have to do a little bit more investigation. So one very, very useful source for knowing some biographical information on someone is to actually look up their obituary, and that is in the historical newspapers. He died in 1966. He wrote several books, so looking on the dust jacket of one of his books, that would be helpful. We're also looking at a book review about one of his books because it tends to include some biographical information, so that's all very helpful. If you do a Google News or a Google Scholar Archive search, perhaps you'll find some resources. We did find this interesting book review. All right, so here's how you quote somebody whose expertise merits mention. According to the New Deal era Washington Post op-ed columnist Carlisle Bargeron, who later wrote a book that harshly criticized the National Recovery Administration, New Deal funding allocation was often subject to whim, depending on who was in charge. And in parentheses, we've put nature's architect. Now, why did we put nature's architect? Because we want to avoid redundancy. We've already said who it is. So to say op-ed columnist Carlisle Bargeron and then putting Bargeron in quotation marks or in the parentheses is silly because we've already established who it is. That would just be repetitive. So if the author's name is included in the narrative, don't repeat it in the parenthetical reference, but do give the reader a roadmap to find more information on the source in the works cited list. In this case, the article's shortened subtitle, since there are 7 articles by Bargeron called Along the Potomac. So if we have the same author and the same title, which is what we have here, because he wrote this column called Along the Potomac with Carlisle Bargeron, we have to find the next piece of information that's going to separate it. So according to the New Deal era Washington Post op-ed columnist Carlisle Bargeron, who later wrote a book that harshly criticized the national recovery system, Washington correspondents were easy targets for New Dealers bearing statistics. Along the Potomac is the title of the column and then the date of publication. Now, that's going to distinguish it from all of the other 7 Along the Potomac entries in the works cited. Now, one of his later works, his letters to the editor, might be cited, referenced a little bit differently, so we're going to give attribution separately. So you'll notice that here are the 2 citations for the letters to the editor. The second one has the dash, 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 and a period to indicate that it is the same author and different source. And here we're going to have, shortly after the passage of the Taft Bill, political columnist and publicist Carlisle Bargeron, who is working on a book about Washington infighting, said in a letter to the editor of his former employer, the Washington Post, that Senator John Lewis acted ethically in his vote for the labor bill. Now, this is a completely different way to describe Carlisle Bargeron than I did in the other 2, and that's because at the time of this writing, he was doing something completely different in his career than he was in the others, and that's relevant to the quote we're using at the time. So there are 2 letters by Carlisle Bargeron in the works cited list, one from the Washington Post and one from the Christian Science Monitor. Since we referenced the author already, we say who it is, so we don't need to put that in parentheses. We could technically omit the parenthetical date, but we're going to include it just to avoid confusion for the reader since the citations are so similar. All right, and that sums up this lesson for today. Please text your questions to 615-669-6670. Thank you.